So we've established message one is that we all have emotions, and yes, they're important, but of course that's just one part of the picture. In society, as human beings, we also need some level of control over our emotions to ensure that they are expressed in an acceptable and in a safe way, suitable for the environment we're in. And this requires us to develop emotion regulation skills. So, what do we mean by emotion regulation? Emotion regulation basically means that we can tolerate emotions that might feel uncomfortable. So things like fear, anger, sadness, without being flooded or overwhelmed by that feeling or having to avoid it completely. This is because we've developed our confidence in our ability to cope with that emotion. We can listen to the important messages that that emotion provides, but without getting overwhelmed. But ultimately, emotion regulation is a lifelong process, and it happens over time. Infants can't regulate their emotions at all, but it's something that they can learn with the support of their caregivers. It's only as individuals moving to adulthood, possibly even our mid to late 20s, that our brains are more fully formed and able to cope more independently with emotion regulation. It also underlies attention and social engagement. So it underlies impulse control, our ability to focus and concentrate. If we're distracted by our emotions, this can have quite large consequences academically and socially. It's also really important for optimal social, emotional and relational development. If we can't regulate emotions in our interactions with others, this can really have a negative impact. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that those with better emotional regulation skills are much more able to participate in social settings. They're more sought after by other children, and families generally experience much less stress. When we're well regulated, this is when we're most available for learning, and there is an optimal level of emotional regulation. If you think about the Winnie the Pooh characters, so Tigger, Eeyore and Winnie the Pooh, Tigger is really when we're hyper aroused, so we're kind of over the top. And Eeyore is when we're perhaps not getting enough stimulation. Winnie the Pooh is that little bit in the middle, which means that we're able to take in information but without being overwhelmed by it. And that's really where we want to be as much as possible. And if people aren't able to develop these skills and they have poor regulation skills, this is when we often see tantrums, rigidity, anxiety, and even disconnection from others. So it's a really important skill to learn. So this is something called the window of tolerance. And learning emotion regulation skills really involves developing this window of tolerance. And what that means is developing a window within which emotions can be tolerated and we can process and act on information appropriately. It's really the state where we are most flexible and able to learn and able to grow. And we develop this window by learning to regulate our emotions as children, learning with our parents or with our caregivers, with our siblings, what emotions are and what we can do about them. Ultimately, everyone has a different sized window of tolerance, and this is based on past experiences. So some are narrower and some are wider. And the wider the window of tolerance, the easier it is to feel emotions without them feeling up here or down here and feeling too overwhelming. If the window is small, emotions are much more likely to feel overwhelming. They're more likely to lead to a fight, flight or freeze response and make it much harder to stay calm and employ strategies to keep our emotions regulated. With the right support, however, regardless of what's been going on in the past, regardless of whether there are things that impact on this window of tolerance, we can slowly learn to widen it so that a greater range of emotions are able to be tolerated. So that's all well and good, but how does somebody develop emotion regulation skills? Basically, the rational and emotional parts of our brain slowly learn to talk to each other over time to help regulate our emotional expression. We go from a place of needing regulation entirely from our parents to co-regulation, and then finally the ability to regulate by ourselves. And generally what happens is that as we're younger, we might use more physical expressions of our emotions, so it might be crying, it might be shouting, whatever that might be. But as we get older, we're much more able to use the verbal expressions, talking to people about our emotions and what they mean for us. Okay. So stage 1 of emotional regulation is when we're babies. And in this state, we rely on other people to regulate our emotions for us. Because in the first year of life, we have very little self-control, very little understanding of what our emotions mean. We have random messages firing away in our brains, we have random sensations going on in our body, but no real understanding about what that means. When an infant comes into the world, they are completely dependent on the people around them, not only to provide physical safety, but emotional security as well. So when they are in emotional distress, it's the caregiver's job to identify their needs, attend to them, and therefore enable the child to feel comfortable and safe again. And this process of support from the parent creates networks and pathways in the brain. It helps the child learn about what to do to soothe themselves when they feel distressed. They learn about their emotions, they learn about what they mean, and through the parent soothing them, they learn how to cope. So stage 2 is as we enter toddlerhood. And this is when we enter the stage of co-regulation. So as humans, we are biologically hardwired to experience emotions. But how we learn to express and regulate those emotions is very much shaped and learned by our experiences. So a toddler has an emotion, they express it in some way, but the way that the caregiver responds to it will teach them how to cope or regulate that emotion in the future. If they feel sad, for example, the biological underpinnings and physiological sensations might lead to them crying, but it's the parent's job to then come on board and help identify what this means and how to respond appropriately. And that's that process of co-regulation. In an ideal world, the parent will comfort the child physically and emotionally, but also use their language to model and teach their own emotional intelligence skills. So having that comfort, but also hearing the words at the same time, helps a child understand their subjective experience. Having that experience of being held and understood helps them naturally begin to understand their own internal world and know what to do with it. Now, at this stage, it's really important to be accepting of the child's emotions rather than challenge them. So if the child feels upset, if they're told there's nothing to cry about, or get over it, you'll be fine, that means that they don't learn this important stage of developing emotional regulation skills. This kind of strategy, whilst I'm sure is never intended to be malicious or hurt the child, it teaches the child to distract themselves or avoid their emotions as if they're not important. So they might feel that their feelings are wrong or unimportant or something to be avoided. And this can often lead to a build-up of distress and a greater likelihood of meltdowns or emotions feeling overwhelming. So stage 3 is as they get a little bit older, and as they get older still, children develop much more of an understanding of their own internal experiences. So not only will they feel the emotion, but the parents' earlier modelling of soothing and labelling the experience becomes internalised. So they can communicate their emotions much more independently. There may also be fewer triggers as their increased independence helps them to make choices for themselves. So emotional regulation becomes much easier in this stage. Now, during teenagers, things become a little bit more complicated because triggers increase. There is a difference created in what teenagers might think they are capable of and what they're actually capable of. So "You're getting in the way of what I want" might become quite a common phrase that you might hear. And as a result, conflict, tantrums, anger increase. Thinking skills are improving, so the brain's developing, but this is counteracted by this conflict going on inside of them. Despite this process of emotional regulation continues to improve, it continues to develop until they reach adulthood and they're willing and able to employ all of these emotional regulation strategies. So, learning how to understand and regulate our emotions is part of a learning process that takes time as brains develop. It involves different parts of our brain that slowly learn to communicate with each other through modelling, practice and repetition. And the hand-brain model is a way of understanding how our brains work and develop. So just for a minute, take your hand and place your thumb over the middle part of your hand and put your fingers over the top. This is a representation of the brain. So here we have the spinal cord going into the brainstem. The limbic system here works to regulate arousal and your emotions, as well as the fight, flight, freeze response. We all then have a higher part of the brain which sits over the top, the cortex. And this is what allows us to perceive the world, to think, to reason. And this very front part of the brain here, which sits around by our forehead, is the prefrontal cortex. And this bit here regulates all of the bits going on downstairs in our emotional centre of our brain. Now, in an ideal world, these two parts sit really closely together and they communicate really well. So we can have emotional experiences, but we also have this higher part of our brain that allows us to regulate them and stop them from feeling overwhelming. But this process of communication between the two takes time, and the two parts of the brain aren't fully connected and communicating consistently until people reach their mid to late 20s. So what happens when these two parts aren't communicating so well? Well, sometimes this downstairs part of the brain gets fired up and it starts almost rumbling. And it responds in a fight, flight or freeze response in situations that might feel threatening. It might be that they're feeling tired, feeling stressed, they hear a dog bark loudly, someone might have shouted, someone might have just pushed our buttons all day, and this emotional centre down here just starts to rumble. All of these things can happen, which means that our emotional brain rumbles so much that we do something called flip our lids, where the rational part of our brain goes completely offline and gets so disconnected from our emotional part that we can no longer think rationally. And it stops us from being able to think flexibly. We lose communication with this upstairs part. And that's the part that would normally help us to calm down. So this creates a problem. As we get older though, these two parts slowly learn to communicate much, much better with themselves. But if we're young and we haven't yet formed lots of connections between the emotional part and the rational part, it can be much, much harder to access it. And this is why children might find it much harder to regulate their emotions or distract themselves when emotions are building up. There will always be times when the downstairs brain gets really agitated and start rumbling. But in time, as the old and the new brain, so the downstairs and the upstairs brain, learn to talk to each other, they start to form connections between each other, have strong pathways, they learn to talk better, helping us to stay calm and manage our emotions much, much better. But it's important to remember this top part of the brain, I mentioned earlier, it doesn't form fully until the mid to late 20s. So it's important to be patient with our children, that they don't always have the capacity to access that rational, thoughtful part of the brain to be able to calm down. And this means that sometimes you might need to lend your own brain, your own upstairs brain, to support them in their emotional regulation. If you want to learn more about this, a video on YouTube called "Why Do We Lose Control of Our Emotions? Why Kids Want to Know" provides a great summary that you can watch with your children. Okay. brain and the body when we do detect a threat, and this emotional downstairs brain starts rumbling? Well, when things are detected as a threat, the body produces certain physical reactions. And the brain can't distinguish objective threats, so something like a bear in front of us, from subjective threats, so something that just feels threatening to us. So this threat response, this fight, flight, freeze response can happen just as easily to being told no or come off your Xbox as it can to hearing a loud bang or being presented with a predator. And what tends to happen with the fight, flight, freeze is that it builds in stages. So we go from level 1, which is getting ready for fight, flight, all the way up to level 4, which is when we're really trying to play dead and we freeze and we're trying to escape from a predator that might have caught us. And each level of this requires a different response and a different level of intervention to help us calm down and get the upstairs brain to come back online. So when the body is preparing for fight flight, so in level 1, perhaps level 2, we can fairly easily access the upstairs brain. But as we go further towards the red zone, the upstairs brain is much more likely to be offline. So that means we might need some very concrete responses, some very sensory responses like deep pressure to calm the body down and bring the rational brain back online. So in summary, we all have emotions, but as we age and mature, we can use our upstairs brain, our rational brain, to express these in a measured and thoughtful way. We need to learn emotional regulation skills so that our downstairs brain doesn't go straight to threat mode and make us panic and act irrationally. We all have emotions, but as humans, and particularly as adults, we can use this upstairs brain to express them in a way that's socially acceptable and appropriate to the environment. And this process is a bit like learning to catch a ball or ride a bike. It doesn't happen straight away. We need time to form those connections and develop the ability. But if you practice over time with support, then it does improve.